She had a voice that could stop time, a voice so pure, so filled with emotion, that it felt as though heaven itself had come to earth. Her music touched souls, her words lifted hearts, and her presence on stage was nothing short of electric. She was loved, admired, and celebrated by all who heard her. A gospel singer who carried the weight of faith and hope in every note she sang. To the world she was an angel, but to one man she was everything. Her partner, her confidant, her lover, a man who stood silently in her shadow, cherishing every moment by her side. If you are not an advocate of domestic violence, murder, child abuse, to mention a few, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more true crime stories. Thank you. To those who saw them together, they were the perfect couple. They shared laughter, secrets, and dreams of a future where her voice would take her to unimaginable heights. But behind the smiles and the bright lights, there were cracks in the foundation of their love, cracks that only they could see. And one day, those cracks split wide open, revealing something far darker than anyone could have imagined. It began innocently enough, as these stories often do. A missed call here, a strange message there. Little things that seem meaningless until they begin to pile up. He started to notice changes. Her distracted gaze, her phone that was suddenly always turned face down, her late nights that grew longer and longer. Suspicion crept in, like a shadow stretching across their once bright world. It whispered in his ear, planted doubts in his mind, and festered into something that consumed him entirely. But this wasn't just a case of infidelity. What he uncovered was more than betrayal. It was a secret so earth-shattering, so unimaginable, that it twisted his love into something grotesque. The man who once adored her, who would have done anything for her, now found himself staring into the abyss of his own rage, a rage that would soon spiral into an act so unspeakable, it left an entire community in disbelief. On the surface, he was calm, collected, a man grappling with his emotions but keeping them locked away. Yet deep within, a storm was brewing, a storm so fierce it would drown any trace of the man he once was. They say love can heal, but what happens when love is tainted by jealousy? What happens when the heart, once filled with devotion, becomes a vessel for hatred? And then, it happened. A single moment that changed everything. A confrontation born out of desperation, a conversation that spiraled out of control, and an act so horrific that it defied explanation. This is the story of a rising star whose light was extinguished far too soon. A woman who gave her heart to a man, only to have it shattered. And a man who let his emotions drive him to the brink of madness, committing an act so brutal, so savage, that it sent shockwaves through the world. It was late summer, 2021, a time when the world seemed to be at peace, when the days stretched lazily into warm evenings. But on this particular evening, beneath the calm surface of this idyllic neighborhood, tragedy struck, sending shockwaves throughout the gospel music community and beyond. At the heart of this tragedy was Chloe Mitchell, a beloved gospel singer whose voice had become a beacon of hope for countless listeners. Known for her spiritual depth, her powerful yet tender voice, and her radiant charisma, Chloe was a rising star in the gospel music world. With a career that was beginning to take off, Chloe's music touched hearts far and wide. Her performances were filled with emotion, and her lyrics spoke to the soul. To her fans, she was a shining example of grace, faith, and love. But to those who knew her closely, she was more than just a public figure. She was a woman of depth, a sister, a friend, and someone deeply invested in the relationships she held dear. And then there was James Rivers. He was a man of few words, quiet, reserved, and fiercely protective of Chloe. James wasn't one to seek attention, preferring to stay in the background while Chloe basked in the spotlight. His devotion to her was undeniable. He supported her career, her dreams, and every step of her journey. They met at a community event a few years prior, a chance encounter that blossomed into a deep, meaningful relationship. He was the man who stayed by her side, helping with her music, attending her concerts, and offering a steady presence as her career began to soar. Together they seemed like the perfect match, the kind of couple everyone looked up to. Their love seemed unshakable, at least from the outside. But as the months went on, something changed. Chloe's fame began to grow, and with it came new challenges. As she toured more, spent more time away from home, and engaged with a broader fan base, cracks began to appear in their once perfect relationship. James, once content to stay in the background, started to show signs of insecurity. Friends who knew them well began to notice it. The way he would give Chloe a tight-lipped smile when she spoke to other men, the way his eyes would narrow with suspicion when her phone buzzed late at night. James had always been protective, but soon his protectiveness turned into something darker, something more possessive. He would ask Chloe where she was, who she was with, and why she was late. Questions that, at first, seemed innocuous, but grew more frequent, more intense. Chloe, meanwhile, was grappling with the increasing pressure of her career and the strain it was placing on her relationship with James. She had always been the loving, devoted girlfriend, but the man who once supported her unconditionally now seemed to be changing into someone else, someone who demanded more, someone who questioned her every move. She found herself torn between her love for him and the growing need for her own space, her own independence. Their once open communication now felt stilted, full of unspoken tension. And while Chloe didn't want to hurt James, she felt trapped. She confided in a few close friends about her struggles, the doubts she had about their relationship, and the guilt she felt for not being able to meet his growing emotional demands. It was then that James began to suspect something more. Late-night messages, whispers when she thought he wasn't listening, and the faintest hint of distance in Chloe's eyes when he looked at her. These things gnawed at him. But it wasn't just simple jealousy. It was the discovery of something that shattered everything he thought he knew about their relationship. Chloe had been seeing someone else. A brief, yet deep betrayal that rocked James to his core. The man who had once adored her felt the sting of her infidelity. The trust they had built together, the promises they had made suddenly seemed to evaporate in an instant. It wasn't just the act of betrayal, it was the secret. The fact that she had kept it hidden and that she had chosen to betray him in the way she had, broke him. He couldn't reconcile the woman he loved with the one who had deceived him. The woman who had once been everything to him was now someone he no longer recognized. As Chloe tried to explain, to apologize, to repair the relationship that was already beginning to unravel, James grew colder. The cracks that had formed earlier now seemed like chasms. The anger and hurt that had been building inside him for weeks, maybe even months, reached a boiling point. Chloe never saw it coming. She had no idea that the love she thought would protect her would be the very thing that turned against her. James at first seemed supportive. He understood the demands of her career and gave her the space she needed. But soon, that understanding began to wear thin. Late-night rehearsals, long-distance gigs, and hours spent with her band and crew started to raise questions in his mind. The first sign of tension came when Chloe had to cancel plans to meet him for dinner because her manager had scheduled an impromptu photo shoot. "It's just one thing after another," she explained to James over the phone, her voice tinged with frustration. "You know how this business works. It's not all in my control." But James, who had always prided himself on being patient and understanding, couldn't shake the feeling of being left behind. He began to resent the hours Chloe spent away from him, the attention she was receiving from others. While she was out signing autographs and posing for pictures, he was sitting alone, wondering if he still mattered as much as he once had. The jealousy crept in slowly, like an unwelcome guest he couldn't escape. One evening, after one of Chloe's concerts, James found himself unable to hold back. As they sat in the quiet of the car, driving home, Chloe excitedly recounted the night's performance. She spoke of the fans who came up to her, the praise from the media, the promises of new opportunities. James listened, but the words grated on him. He felt a burning jealousy simmering beneath the surface. Finally, unable to keep it inside, he asked, "You spend so much time with them, with your fans, with your team. What about me? Where do I fit into all this?" Chloe was caught off guard. She knew the pressures of her career, but this was the first time James had voiced his feelings of insecurity. She tried to reassure him. But James wasn't convinced. The cracks were there, widening with every passing day. The tension didn't stop there. Over time, the jealousy and possessiveness grew. James began to question Chloe more and more. He would ask about the people she met on her tours, about the messages she received, about the men who complimented her on her beauty. Chloe brushed it off at first, chalking it up to his insecurities. "You're the only one for me," she would say, kissing him on the cheek. But her reassurances were never enough. The breaking point came one evening when Chloe returned from a weekend away. She had gone on a short trip for a performance, a routine part of her growing career. But when she walked through the door, there was something off about her. She was unusually quiet, her eyes avoiding his as she set her bags down. James didn't say anything at first. He simply observed her, waiting for her to speak. But she didn't. Instead, she busied herself in the kitchen, unpacking her things in silence. That was when he noticed it. The phone. Chloe's phone, which she had once left casually on the counter, was now clutched tightly in her hands as if it were a lifeline. She had always been open with her phone, allowing James to see messages or calls without hesitation. But now she seemed to guard it like it was something precious, something that shouldn't be seen. James felt a surge of anger rise in him, a hot, bitter feeling that he couldn't push down. "Who's that?" he asked, pointing to her phone, his voice low but filled with tension. Chloe stiffened at the question, her fingers tightening around the device. "It's just work," she replied, her tone flat, defensive. James didn't believe her. "Work?" he repeated, the words sharp and cutting. "Then why are you acting so weird about it? Let me see." For a brief moment, Chloe hesitated. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Then, with a sigh, she handed the phone over to him. As James looked at the screen, his heart raced, his breath catching in his throat. There, staring back at him, was a message that would change everything. It wasn't just one message. It was a string of them dating back weeks. Messages from a man named Caleb, someone Chloe had met on one of her tours. The messages were flirtatious, sometimes intimate, and the tone was unmistakable. "I can't wait to see you again," one read. "You're always on my mind," said another. And the worst part, at least in James's mind, was the final message, the one that confirmed his worst fears. "You're amazing, Chloe. I can't stop thinking about you. Maybe we can find a place to be alone next time." James's hands trembled as he scrolled through the conversation. Each message felt like a slap in the face, each word a dagger that twisted deeper into his heart. His world, already fragile from the strain of his insecurities, began to crumble around him. How could she do this? How could Chloe, the woman he had loved and trusted, betray him in such a public and hurtful way? He felt humiliated, exposed, and the anger surged in waves, consuming him with every passing second. The woman he had built his life around had chosen someone else. For a moment, everything around him went quiet. He could barely hear his own thoughts over the sound of his heartbeat thundering in his chest. How had he missed it? How had he not seen the signs sooner? His mind raced as his emotions battled each other. Anger, betrayal, confusion, and humiliation all fighting for dominance. The tears that stung his eyes were not of sadness. They were of rage, of a deep, seething anger that seemed to rise from somewhere deep inside him. Chloe, sensing the shift in the room, walked toward him, her voice shaky as she tried to explain. "James, please, let me explain. It's not what you think. But James didn't let her finish. He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He threw the phone across the room, the impact of it crashing against the wall seeming to punctuate the suffocating silence that had settled between them. His voice, when it came, was a mixture of disbelief and fury. "How could you do this to me? How could you lie to me? We were supposed to be everything to each other." Chloe stepped back, her face pale, her hands trembling. She wanted to apologize, to explain herself, but the words wouldn't come. She had never seen him this angry, this out of control. She wanted to tell him that it wasn't what it seemed, that it had been a mistake, that Caleb had meant nothing. But deep down, she knew that it was too late for apologies. The damage had been done. "I trusted you," James continued, his voice cracking with emotion. I gave you everything, Chloe. And this is how you repay me? He couldn't hear her anymore. He didn't want to. All he could hear was the roar of betrayal, drowning out everything else. The life he had imagined, the future he had planned, was slipping away in front of him, and the rage in his chest wouldn't allow him to think clearly. He couldn't calm down, couldn't step back and process what was happening. All he could feel was the weight of his own humiliation and the overwhelming need to make Chloe feel the same way he did, betrayed, abandoned, and utterly powerless. It was around 9:30 p.m. when James finally reached the breaking point. He paced in their apartment back and forth, his footsteps growing louder with each passing minute. Chloe was in the living room, sitting on the couch, her head buried in her hands, as if trying to block out the chaos that had erupted around them. She had tried to reach out to him earlier, but the words always seemed to get lost in the tense silence that hung between them. She wanted to explain herself, to make him understand that the affair had been a mistake, that Caleb meant nothing, but she couldn't find the right words. How could she explain away the hurt she had caused? James barely acknowledged her presence. The sound of his feet pounding the floor seemed to drown out her attempts to speak, and as he turned to face her, his eyes were wild, filled with a storm of fury. His hands shook as he gripped the back of a chair, his knuckles white from the pressure. In that moment, Chloe saw the man she had once known, his calm, collected demeanor, had disappeared completely. The man standing in front of her was someone she didn't recognize. The anger in his eyes was something primal, something uncontrollable. She could feel the tension building, a suffocating weight pressing down on her chest. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. Please don't do this." But it was too late. The words seemed to hit the air and dissipate, as if they had never existed. The space between them crackled with an unbearable electricity, and James couldn't stop the thoughts that swirled in his head. His hands twitched, wanting to lash out, wanting to make her feel the hurt he was experiencing, but something in him, some shred of humanity, still tried to hold him back. But that voice, the one that had once been rational, was fading fast. He turned abruptly and stormed into the kitchen. It was there, in the quiet of the small, dimly lit room, that he found what he was looking for. The knife. It gleamed in the light, its blade sharp, cold, and unforgiving. It wasn't the first time he had used it in the kitchen, but tonight, it had become something else entirely. James gripped the handle tightly, as if it were his only ally in a world that had suddenly turned on him. He stood there for a moment, staring at the knife, his breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't the way he had imagined things going, but the rage inside him was too much to ignore now. It was drowning out everything, every rational thought, every trace of compassion. And when he returned to the living room, Chloe barely had time to react before the situation spiraled completely out of control. "What are you going to do, James?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. There was no answer. She could see it in his eyes. The decision had already been made. He didn't need to say a word. James moved toward her, the knife clutched tightly in his hand. The room felt colder, the air thick with tension as Chloe stood up, her heart hammering in her chest. She took a step back, but James's movements were swift. "No!" she cried out, but it was too late. The blade flashed, cutting through the air with a sickening swiftness that left no time for her to react. The scene that followed unfolded in a blur, violent, chaotic, and heartbreaking. The sharp metallic sound of the knife hitting its mark echoed in the silence of the room. Chloe gasped, her body jerking in shock, but the pain was only temporary. Her life was slipping away with each passing second. The air around them seemed to close in, heavy with the weight of finality. James stood over her, his face a mask of disbelief, as if unable to fully comprehend the horror of what he had just done. He had never imagined it would end like this. He hadn't thought it through. He had only acted on impulse, on the intense, overwhelming emotions that had clouded his judgment. But as he looked down at Chloe, her body crumpling beneath him, he knew that he couldn't undo what had just occurred. From the hallway, the sound of Chloe's final screams could be heard, high-pitched and filled with terror as she struggled to breathe, to hold on to the life that was rapidly fading from her body. The noise echoed through the building, reverberating off the walls, but no one came to help. The apartment was eerily quiet after that, almost too quiet, as if the world outside had paused in disbelief, unwilling to acknowledge the tragedy unfolding inside. As the police descended upon the scene, James stood motionless, a figure who seemed trapped in time. The rage, the emotions that had driven him to this point, had seemingly dissipated, replaced by a hollow numbness. When the officers entered the apartment, they didn't find the man they expected to confront, a violent, resisting criminal. Instead, they found a man who seemed lost, as if he were unable to comprehend the consequences of his actions. There was no defiance in his eyes, no attempt to flee or to deny what had happened. He simply looked at the officers, a strange calmness overtaking him, and surrendered without a fight. "I did it," James said softly when they asked him what had happened. His voice lacked the emotion one might expect from someone who had just committed murder. It was as though he had already resigned himself to the fact that there was no going back. No explanation, no justification could undo what had transpired. The officers were momentarily taken aback. Murderers usually fought back, denied their guilt, or tried to hide their involvement. But James? He didn't fight. He didn't try to lie or make excuses. He simply stood there, the weight of his actions settling over him like an unshakable shroud. His confession was simple, almost mechanical, as if he had rehearsed it in his head 1,000 times. In his mind, the act was already done, and nothing could change the reality of it. "I loved her," he said, almost as if explaining to himself rather than the officers. "I loved her so much, and she betrayed me. I couldn't let her go. I couldn't let her hurt me like that." As they led him away from the apartment, his hands cuffed behind his back, James seemed detached from everything around him. His head was low, his eyes fixed on the ground, but his mind was somewhere else, lost in a labyrinth of guilt and rationalizations. The world outside seemed to move on without him, unaware of the storm that had just torn apart the fabric of his life. To the outside world, James was a man who had committed an unspeakable crime, but in his mind he was still the man who had been wronged, the man who had loved someone who had betrayed him. How could anyone possibly understand the depth of his pain? Later, in the sterile confines of an interrogation room, James's confession became more detailed. He spoke of his relationship with Chloe, how they had built a life together, how they had dreamed of a future that was now shattered beyond recognition. He spoke of the betrayal that had unraveled everything they had worked for, how he had trusted her completely, only to find out that trust had been broken in the most painful way possible. "I never thought she'd do that to me," James muttered, his eyes blank, his voice hollow. "I thought we were going to be happy. I thought she was my everything." The detectives listened carefully, their pens scratching the surface of their notepads as they jotted down every word. They weren't sure if he truly understood the gravity of what he had done, or if he was merely spinning a story, a defense, an attempt to justify the unjustifiable. And yet, despite the rationalizations, despite his efforts to explain his actions, it was clear there was no undoing the death of Chloe Mitchell. "Did she deserve to die?" one of the detectives asked bluntly, his voice cutting through the thick silence of the room. James didn't answer immediately. His eyes flickered, and for a brief moment he seemed to wrestle with the question, as if the full weight of what had happened hadn't fully settled on him yet. "No," James whispered after a long pause. "No, she didn't deserve to die. But she deserved to feel the pain I felt. She deserved to understand how much she hurt me." It was in this moment that the chilling reality of his confession began to take shape. James wasn't a man overwhelmed by momentary rage. He wasn't driven by blind fury alone. What he described was far more disturbing, a sense of entitlement over Chloe, a desire to control her and punish her for what he perceived as her betrayal. This wasn't just the tragic consequence of a heated argument gone wrong. This was something darker. The detective, having heard countless confessions in his career, knew that this was not just a simple case of revenge. This was a story of control, of manipulation, of a man who felt he had ownership over another person's life. The murder wasn't just a moment of uncontrollable rage. It was a premeditated act. It was calculated, planned, and executed with chilling precision. The question began to take root in the minds of the authorities, and it's a question that would hang over the trial. Did the act of betrayal justify this heinous crime, or was it a premeditated act of control?